and developing environmental policies and action plans. And if you want to know more about that, you can visit the Julie's Bicycle website. And this webinar is actually supported by a strand of that program called the Colour Green. And just a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Farah and Sharice. The conversation today is going to be recorded, so your microphones and videos have been turned off. If you think of any questions throughout the chat that you'd like to ask Sharice or Farah, just please use the Q&A function in the webinar software to send them to us. You can find the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll get to them at the end. If you'd like to share resources, thoughts, anything else with other attendees, you can use the chat function. Try and set the option there to say all attendees, because otherwise it just comes to us as panelists. If you have any technical difficulties, our colleague Ruby is on hand to resolve them. You can't see her, she's hiding behind where it says Julie's Bicycle, but she is there. So you can use the chat function to flag any issues to her, select the option all panelists, and it will just come to us. You can continue the conversation on your preferred social channels using the hashtag Creative Climate Chat, and also the handles at Julie's Bicycle and at Sharice Janine with an underscore at the end. And finally, we are live streaming today's session as well as being here on Zoom. So Ruby will share the link in the chat if you want to share that with anyone else to join in the conversation on socials and elsewhere. And finally, just before we get going, we've got a little poll for you, a bit of a check-in before we really go into the conversation. So really asking you that during the pandemic and the lockdown, whether you've been able to continue to progress your work on climate and environmental issues, whether you've had new ideas or inspirations or made new connections, or whether you haven't really had the capacity to focus on this work at this time. So we'll let that run for just a moment. Cool, so I will share where you're all at with you. It's actually a fairly even split. So just under a third of you have been continuing your work as usual. Quite encouragingly, most of you have had new inspirations or made new connections, but also around a third of you just haven't had the capacity to focus on climate and environmental issues. So thank you so much for tuning in today and actually making the brain space to be part of this conversation. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Farah and to our guest, Sharice. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara, and welcome everyone who's listening in. As you've heard, Creative Climate Chats is our new series with creative leaders and thinkers who are engaged in meaningful and innovative climate action. So in the first series of Creative Climate Chats, we featured Lucy Davies, Newcomer, and Rajpal and Zamzam Ibrahim. Sorry. We talked about how the cultural sector is responding to net zero targets, a green cultural recovery from COVID-19, climate action, student activism, and climate justice through the lens of colonial history. I'm just going to check my sound quality. Okay, great. So today we kick off the second series of Creative Climate Chats, and this fits into our podcast, The Colour Green, which is part of our Arts Council England environmental programme, where we're spotlighting artists and creative practitioners of colour whose work speaks to the interactions between climate justice, social justice and nature. So you can watch all the recordings of the first series of Creative Climate Chats on our website, and the podcast is available also on our website, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are exploring how science and environmental policy shape and inform each other, and how the arts and cultural sector can help to communicate, reimagine and redesign those spheres. As we consider how we re-emerge from the global coronavirus lockdown, we have an obligation to one another to join the dots between the corona crisis, economic uncertainty, public health, the loss of biodiversity, structural inequality, and climate disaster. These are all issues which are hugely destructive alone, but which exacerbate and feed into one another. So while we're all reeling from the grief and upheaval of the pandemic, a quarter of Bangladesh is underwater just 2 months after devastating cyclone Amphan. Locust plagues have torn through South Asia and Africa, and last week Baghdad reached a blistering 51.7 degrees Celsius, which is a new record high. It's clear, and the science tells us, that in order to avert the worst effects of climate change, we need to urgently enact radical new policies. We need to divest from our fossil fuel dependent structures and invest in the communities hardest hit by these interconnected crises. So we're really thrilled today to be joined by Sharice Johnson. Sharice is a science policy researcher, an environmental justice advocate, and a relative newcomer to the UK. As a policy advisor at the British Academy, she looks at how we make policy that works for people and is rooted in science, breaking down silos to bring together the social and the scientific in ways that uphold democratic values and solve environmental issues. Her past professional experiences are diverse, ranging from work on endangered species, chemical safety and air pollution, ocean conservation, and gender and racial equality in STEM. So that's quite a lot. So welcome, Sharice. Thank you. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful being here. Thank you.
So we'll get started just by asking you to tell us a little bit about your work and how you came into this space.
Sure. Well, I was originally going to tell you all about just what I'm doing at the moment at the British Academy, but I thought it might be a little more interesting to give you some background into just how I got into environmentalism, just because I feel it's important right now for folks who maybe aren't that engaged with environmentalism or climate change or any of that, to see that you don't have to look a certain way, you don't have to come from a certain background, and there are no expectations for, there are really no expectations other than please get involved and get involved very soon. So some background, in 2010, so it's 10-year anniversary for me of when I started to care about the environment. And I lived in Texas. The BP oil spill had just happened. I'm sure you all remember that. It's terrible. And I was not at all an environmentalist, and I, you know, what I always tell people is I was that person who drove their car to the grocery store, even though I lived right across the street from the grocery store, and I would drive there. Like, I was that person. So this oil spill happened, and I just saw it on the news one day at the gym. I think it was about 3 days in at that point, and I mean, I couldn't believe it. I absolutely could not believe that something like that was happening, and that it was happening still, and that it hadn't been stopped. And then so I had a lot of questions, right? I was not really engaged, not only environmentally, but I wasn't really civically engaged either. If I'm honest, the things that I cared about, the things that were closest on my mind were, I lived paycheck to paycheck. I was a barista, I was a student. I cared about, studying for a test, or, boys, silly. But well, the paycheck to paycheck thing was not silly. That's real. But I just kind of, I realized I didn't actually know how things like that were even allowed to happen. And that what was so mind-boggling to me is how do we, like, how important is it for us to extract, you know, resources from the sea, from the earth, that we would put an entire, well, an entire ecosystem, but also other humans at risk? How important is it? Why would it do that? Like, why, how is one life not important enough not to do something that dangerous if it's not necessary, right? So I started wondering, you know, I was just finishing up school. I just finished up school, my undergrad degree in psychology, and I didn't know what to do. I was looking at grad programs to continue in psychology. And so I just, you know, just tried to throw school at it, you know, try to throw education at it. I was like, well, I don't really know what to do. You know, I feel like most people would be like, oh, well, I could go volunteer, right? I could go just join some kind of organization and volunteer my services. But no, I was like, no, I have to learn everything there is to know about the ocean. And I have to know, I need to learn everything there is to know about ocean creatures. And I need to figure out how events like this affect the like the chemistry of the ocean. I need to figure out how this affects all of the different organisms in the ocean, and then ultimately humans. Because maybe if I can figure that out, if I have this science, then maybe they will listen, and maybe they, whoever is making decisions at this point is they to me, maybe they will stop doing it. Very naive, very, very naive. Clearly, I did not know anything about how these things actually worked, especially in the US. So I found myself eventually in a coral biology lab where I was looking at cells under a microscope all day, and just, you know, trying to figure out why coral bleaching existed. I mean, I think I won't get too into that, but and how they respond. So what the immune response was of the algae that live within the coral, right? And that's when I started learning about things like climate change and ocean acidification and nutrient pollution, and just also known as ways that humans can be pretty terrible and not really care about anything other than, you know, themselves, honestly. And so that is what got me to Washington, D.C. to go to grad school. I know it sounds like a long-winded question, but I promise you, I mean, a long-winded response. But so I get there, complete outsider, not knowing much about the environment, join an environmental science master's program. And what I started noticing very, very soon after starting was that the way people spoke about the environment and the way people spoke about climate change didn't include people like me. It never did. It never did. I was like, I don't know who you're talking to. You know, I would try and I would learn the language, you know, I would learn the academic language, and I could parrot it back. I could, you know, I could repeat the jargon back. But I didn't know how that was going to help me make sense of that to other people who were like me, or people back home, you know, who were like, well, what does this have to do with me? I don't live near an ocean. Okay, so that eventually got me out of the just pure science mentality, and got me thinking, okay, this is the next step. Now we have to figure out how it is we can communicate this and get everybody on board. And then I ended up happening upon learning about environmental justice and learning about how those issues existed for decades within like Black and Latino communities in the U.S. And then also environmental justice in the context of Global South, and that's where it all started. And so that was a very long story, but all of that I felt was very important for you all to know about me to start off.
So it's really interesting. Were you at all interested in the ocean before you learned about the BP oil spill, or was that a very, very direct sort of route in for you?
I was interested in the ocean kind of the way I guess many people are, you know, just kind of superficially. I lived in Hawaii when I was younger for a few years, but I was also not, you know, I didn't have that connection, like that strong connection. I don't have a story. I don't have that kind of story to tell people where I'm like, oh, yeah. And, you know, when I first stepped into the waters, I could just feel it. No, I don't have any of that. So my connection to the ocean didn't start that way. But it did happen, and I'm really thankful for it.
Amazing. You spoke at our conference in February, We Make Tomorrow, about the language that we use about the environment. So sort of going back to that, those people who you met when you first started to learn about environmentalism and do your ocean conservation work. And you talked about how it's deliberately othering. When we talk and we think about the environment, we erase urban settings, we erase human experiences, and we separate ourselves from the non-human, which allows us to extract from it as we choose. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and why it's important that we better reflect what we mean by the environment in our language?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a good follow-up question, because absolutely that is what really struck me, is how we were talking about it and how exclusive it was, and it didn't include, you know, like I said, it didn't include people like me. And so the importance is obviously when you have language that excludes, you will, especially in policy, you're inevitably going to end up hurting someone, because you're going to be leaving them out by some way, right? And it's and you know that, because in policy too, they or even in legal documents, like think about law, right? How deliberate every single word, every word in a document is. And they place it there. So like, oh, I'm not going to use this word because that's a little too vague, and then there's too much room for interpretation. So words matter. The words are incredibly important. There's a lot of meaning to them. I mean, we as humans created the words at some point, and then the thing is, we learn them, right? We come into this world, we learn them based on context, but we don't necessarily learn the history of it. And that is something I think more folks are starting to realize now, is that we need to pay attention to the history of some of these words, because it's just loaded with so much exclusion and just so much oppression. And another thing that I talked about with language, I think you all shared an article, a blog post that I had written when I was at UCS, when I was talking about endangered species and social justice, and I was making that connection, which, I mean, I definitely got some looks at first. You're like, what? Okay, now you're just doing some leftist, you know, social justice warrior stuff. Like, no, trust me, it's the same thing. It's when we say nature and when we say environment, and we don't mean us, right? Like, we don't mean people like me, we don't mean people like you. You're gonna alienate people and ecosystem. And when you think of nature, you're always just seeing some pristine kind of place, some naturescape. And then you're just like, oh, well, okay, I guess where I live, like, that's not environment, so everything is getting away. And then you feel like you can't ever be a part of it. It's over there, it's so far, and you don't have access to it. And that just, I think, is harmful, especially now we're seeing for people to get involved in this movement, in the environmental movement, because Black and brown people have been environmentalists. We just weren't included in that word. We did not see ourselves as that. I spoke to you yesterday about this, and I said, you know, my image of an environmentalist was not me. I refused. I did not call myself that until probably 2014 or so. I refused, because to me, an environmentalist was somebody who was elitist, somebody who could afford all of the fancy REI Tivas, the gear, and who could go to Yosemite and who could take all these.
I don't even know what any of that is.
I'm sorry, this is very US centric. I'm sorry, everybody. Basically, people who could afford all of the fanciest gear to go to a far off, beautiful, protected area and spend their time to, then you get to see it on Instagram, the beautiful pictures, right? So that's, to me, that's what it was. And I wasn't that. So I will continue stressing, and I will not stop saying, like, the way we talk about it is incredibly important, because we need to see ourselves in it, and the language you use can either exclude or include us, and it'd be better if it included us, because we might get somewhere.
I think that's so important, and the reminder that for people of color and for communities of color, we have been at the forefront of that for not years, not decades, but centuries. And the word that I always come back to that made it kind of click for me, I don't think I called myself an environmentalist until about 3 years ago. But tree hugger is always the word that I think about, because I never ever associated that with people like me, but actually the history of it is rooted in North Indian anti-colonial women who chained themselves to trees centuries ago, and then that was revitalized in the 70s again as an anti-colonialist environmental form of protest, and that's never something that I had seen when I had thought or seen things about being a tree hugger. It was never the stereotype, but it's my lineage, it's my history, and it's my ancestors, so that made so much more click for me to think about it in that way.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I'm really curious about how, like, the evolution of that, like the definition of that word, like how people saw that word, when did that happen? Did it get co-opted? Like, why did we start seeing tree huggers as being, mostly white people with, okay, I'm sorry, this is what my image always was like a white person with a trust fund who was just trying to explore their, like go and find themselves somewhere, like go to another country and find themselves. So that's kind of how I always saw it. That history is really good to know. Thank you.
I something I tell everyone now, but that communicating of climate change and climate action and environmentalism is quite often missing in quite a lot of the way that we talk about science. What do you think scientists can learn from the arts about communicating all of these histories and this language, and vice versa? What can the arts do to actually engage with that science, to engage with that language differently, to engage with policy?
Yeah, so what can science learn from the arts? So many things. Well, one, I have to say there are a lot of people out there right now doing some great work in this overlap, like in this space where they're, using art to talk about their science, and I love it. I can't really think of any of the names. I think there's one like Christine Liu, maybe on Twitter, like photon art or something like that. And there's like Hannah Ayub, she does art and science, and I think that's amazing. There's so much overlap, right? Like even I saw there's a neon artist who does neon art of, I think, like, I want to say it's like cellular structures or something. It's very cool, right? It's very cool. And it teaches people who wouldn't necessarily be interested in learning science from like in a classroom or lab setting, and understanding what it has to do with their world. I think that scientists could learn a lot about, well, they could learn a lot about communication from artists. It's a stereotype for a reason, right? Like I realized even in myself, when I talk about things, I always have to offer all of these, like I have to offer every perspective possible just so I can't be called out on a certain thing. Right, I can't just offer my pure response. It's just got to be like caveat here, like disclaimer, 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 and also here's a graph, right? And nobody really cares about that, right? And like graphs aren't even that useful, honestly. Charts and figures, like that kind of stuff is not even that useful to take to policymakers. They just want to know the point. Like, what does this have to do with me? What is it that you want? Like, what is it that you're trying to do? And I think art can get to that point, and artists can get to that point. And they also, I think the thing that artists can do is they offer that emotion, right? The emotion that we're all seeking, and that we're human, and we want that, and we want to connect, and for the most part, and we want that, you know, empathy and compassion, and that comes when, I mean, I said this before, look, you can't, if you don't feel something, if you can't connect to it, then you can't really care about it, you know, and then you don't really, and that translates to policies too, right? So if somebody just gives you a bunch of facts and figures, it means nothing to them, but then you give them a story behind it. If you tell them, you know, the levels of nitrous oxide in the air that day, whatever, in a community, that says something to a scientist. But then if you give a story about a young girl who has severe asthma and died because of the air pollution, as has happened, then that speaks a little differently. And if you had a painting that showed those, that conveyed those emotions, or if you did some piece of, or in music, or anything like that, you get across, one, to a different set of people, but you also get that emotion out of people that we really need.
That's hugely important. How do you think that our creative organizations and institutions can take that and use that to better serve the social contract that we have with each other, and as arts organizations, as community hubs, and still maintain the environment and well-being at the heart of how we work?
Let's see. How can arts organizations, I think my response to this kind of always goes back to the idea of making sure nobody's left out, and kind of looking at your own, the way that you're defining certain things, and who it is that you're actually letting in. And basically, like, as arts and cultural institutions, you can make sure that you're not gatekeeping, right? You can make sure that whatever culture or art it is that you're trying to explore isn't just whatever the idea is from your maybe more narrow perspective, and it includes other people. And in that way, you know, you'll get more people, and you'll hear more stories, and you just, I think, it just goes back to not leaving anybody out, and making sure that everybody feels that they can be a part of that community. So I think all organizations, not even just arts and cultural, every organization can do more to make sure that they are looking at the words they use and the things that they say, in their, from their programmatic areas to their recruiting processes to, you know, if they give research awards, what is it that you're rewarding? What is it that you're awarding? What are your guidelines, and who does that serve?
Really important. Yeah, that makes sense. Going back to you and your personal sort of experiences and the work that you've been doing here in the UK at the British Academy, but back in the US as well, so you're obviously American. What's the biggest difference in how the UK and the USA are currently developing climate and action, climate and environmental policies?
Yeah. So biggest difference, and I think the biggest, most glaring thing is obviously to me, you know, less than 100 days, the US won't be a part of the Paris Agreement anymore. So internationally, that says something. That says, okay, well, I mean, the US is losing their grip on a lot of things, and I don't think that they are much of a leader in many ways right now. And definitely in climate, internationally, they're not. I mean, that's what that says. Now, the UK, on the other hand, has stepped up and said, like, we have this ambition and we're going to do net zero 2050. Hey, yeah, that's wonderful. So that sounds good. That's talking the talk. But then when you look deeper, it's like, so where is it? How are you going to do it? When does it start? So that is my way of saying, good job, UK. You have a moment right now. You can be a leader. You can lead the way. And how great would that look? Right? I mean, come on. If you, we're not going to stop calling out all of the things that have happened historically, right? Because we're on that right now, and we're not going to stop. So things are looking pretty bad right now, but you have a moment in time right now to say, like, okay, we recognize all of that stuff we did and what we contributed to it, both here and in the global South and in all these places. So what we're going to do is we're going to make up for it, and we're going to do better, and we're going to make these commitments. We're going to include communities, because communities have solutions. We're going to make sure that we're not just continuing to oppress people by our policies, and we're going to make it better for the future, starting now.
Great. So on that, and you know, we're hosting COP26, which has been rescheduled to next year. We have this cultural renewal task force that the government has set up as we're re-emerging from the coronavirus shutdown. Like, they're all connected and all need to be speaking to one another. So what's the thing that you would say to that task force, and to, you know, to how we manage COP as well?
Yeah, well, to the task force, I say, do not let the one Black woman on the force be the person who has to speak up all the time on Black issues, because Black issues are all our issues, because they're all intertwined. We're all here. It's not a race thing. Like, we have to all be in this together. So I would definitely say that, don't tokenize. And I would say, you know, think about, again, with the definitions, what you mean by cultural, whose culture, what culture is going to be included, whose voices, whose stories, whose work, and make sure it's an accurate representation of all of the rich culture there is here.
Great answer. So just a quick reminder to everyone listening, if you've got any questions, please just pop them into the Q&A box and we'll get to them in a few moments. But yeah, I mean, as we speak about communities and allowing communities to lead the way, and the solutions that they have, that we have within our stories as well. How do we strengthen the networks that we have, and strengthen the networks between frontline communities around the world, especially in the face of political inaction or you know, danger even? There was a Guardian article last week, about how last year was the deadliest on record for environmental activists, not in the UK, not in the States necessarily, but around the world. How do we strengthen those communities?
How do we strengthen the communities? Well, yeah, right now in this context of, you know, during pandemic, when many of us are just inside and not getting out and not getting to be in our communities, but you know, we're relying a lot on this kind of thing, virtual organizing and digital experiences, social media and all that. So I would say that still is not an excuse to let those relationships go. It is just a chance for you to find a more creative way to keep engaging with communities for sure. I know personally for the last few months that I've been inside, I've connected probably more to people in the environmental community than I have since I've moved here. I mean, obviously there are a lot of factors for that, but what I'm saying is it's possible. It just takes a will and the recognition that it's important to do. And so that's something that, I mean, I've realized at this point, it sounds to me like maybe it's just my bubble that I'm in, but it sounds to me like so many institutions are recognizing all of this and like, oh, this is important. But I guess my biggest piece of advice would just be go beyond tokenism. You know, just don't make it tokenistic, and don't make it just because it's a popular thing to do. You got to be genuine, and because otherwise, like I still don't think it'll work, you know, because then you'll just have everything implode, you know, kind of like right before I got on this call, I found out that the organization I used to work at is, I mean, they're embroiled in all kinds of stuff right now with people of color leaving the organization and calling them out for racism, which is true. But on paper they were so good, right? And they meant so well, and they everything they looked like they were doing it right, but the fact of the matter is it wasn't genuine. Like each person hadn't internalized that, and it fell apart. So I would just say to these organizations, just go beyond being tokenistic.
That's really important, and approaching things like climate action can't be a trend. It can't be something that is picked up and then dropped off. It has to be something that's embedded throughout how we work, how we live, how we structure our organizations, where our money goes. And when it's inauthentic, I think that it's obvious. You know, I've met many people who talk about climate justice, and it's very obvious to me when people aren't approaching that structurally or systematically. And I don't know how that feels for you.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when I first moved here, one of the biggest obstacles I had in adjusting to being here was around the conversation of environmental justice and climate justice, because I was talking about one thing, but it seemed that people were talking about something completely different, and I didn't know what they were talking about. I'm like, this doesn't sound like justice to me. Like, whatever you're talking about is not justice. And I'm not talking about just, you know, Black capitalism or you know, like more people of color means more representation is great. Representation is good, but the point is the idea of whiteness and just even white supremacy is not a thing that has whiteness itself is not necessarily only white people. Like we're all born into it. If you know, we're all if you go to university, you learn under the same systems, and a lot of that is internalized. And so what I want for people is to really reflect on that, everyone, and to think about what that means and who it is that you're serving, and yeah, and just think more about what your actions, what the consequences of your actions or inaction really are going to be.
I think that's really the heart of what a conversation around justice could look like and should look like, isn't it? And sort of leading on from that, for you as a policy advisor, what does meaningful climate action and climate policy actually look like? How do those conversations about justice filter through into how we create policy for everyday life?
I guess honestly, I feel like I'm being so repetitive at this point, but honestly, again, meaningful climate action, climate policy, all that means being inclusive, making sure it's accessible and not just having tokens, you know, like it was, and again, it's always like going beyond tokenism. So like I mentioned before about communities having solutions, this is something that you'll hear a lot when, especially in the environmental justice community, because this isn't, these issues might be new for some people, you know, like they might be new, you know, you're sitting at home during the pandemic, you've got nothing to do, you're on Instagram, here's all these pretty shiny graphics, which I also have. And but the fact of the matter is there have been people working on this for decades, people losing their lives to this for decades, and let's stop that. Like we let's not lose anyone else. You know, let's just get to it now. So no more excuses, no more, oh, there's not enough political will. Create it. All right, no more of that, because that is always the thing you always hear. Oh, there's not enough this, there's not enough that. I'm like, oh, well, you know what? You know what this pandemic taught me? It taught me you can do it if you need to, if it affects you. And ultimately it will affect you. Maybe it's not affecting you right now, but it will. And just think it's affecting other people. So get to work.
Great. Again, please do send through your questions. So we've got a couple here. One from Sarah Taylor. I work for a nature conservation organization on climate change, and I'm desperate for us to do better with communication and language, making the connections with arts and storytelling. How can we work better together, and how do we do it quickly, as we don't have decades to make this happen?
How can we work better together? You mean how can conservation organizations work better with communities to tell stories,
Yeah,
or just
with the arts? Yeah.
And do it quickly. See, and that's the other thing too, isn't it? Oh, with doing quickly. I know we have to do it quickly, but like I will just kind of go back to that thing I said about some people being in this space for decades. So while it's a sprint for some people, it's been a marathon for others, and relationship building takes time. So you've got to just be authentic, be genuine in your relationships, and don't make it an extractive relationship, you know, like amplifying people's stories and art and all of that is one thing, but like taking it on and then getting credit for it and all that, that's one way to alienate yourself with communities for sure, and with people, because I know the goal is the same, you know, we want the same thing ultimately, but we're still human. So we still need to be treated that way. We still need to have our relationships nurtured. And so that's something you have to think about when you go into it. And if you don't know, some consultants can help you. Pay them.
Great. So we've got another question from Connor Tracy. Hi, Sharice, please can you explain your day-to-day job and how you got to your position?
Yes, I can. So actually, I'm not going to tell you day-to-day, because day-to-day is, you know, like many of us, emails. But yeah, so I have been at the British Academy now since January, and I'm working on an environmental sustainability program of work, among other things. But over the last few months, since with COVID-19, we kind of switched tack and did some rapid response kind of a series of workshops, which was amazing. It was called Shape the Future, and it was thinking about, you know, a post-COVID world, you know, using from the perspectives of the disciplines represented in the humanities and social sciences. And so we got to convene some of the, you know, most you know, well-known scholars in these areas to talk about things like you know, nature, and talk about the importance of language. Again, that's always going to be there. It's a common theme. So there was one, living with or against nature was one. There was one on words, stigma, and the coronavirus, which was led by a historian, or I believe she was a bioarchaeologist actually, which was amazing. There was one on elections in light of COVID-19, implications for young people, and so on. I could keep going. There were 18. I won't go into all of them. But anyway, so basically in my job right now, there's a lot of convening of minds, you know, like convening of academics, of experts in both academia and in civil society, and getting them together with government officials and making sure that there's kind of like a, you know, we're actually communicating certain things, so it's not all siloed, because it doesn't do any good to have all this knowledge if it's not going towards actual change, right? I mean, because there's a lot, we're sitting on a lot of knowledge, and folks can really do a lot to help things. So that is my day-to-day job, and I got to that position because I started thinking more about how important social science is for solving problems. I'm a huge science fan, you know, like I love science, like in general, because, but I realized there's only so much we can do. You know, you can only throw so much science and tech at a problem before you just create more problems. And I feel like if the point is to change things for society and for humans, then you might want a perspective that studies the way society and humans tick.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Eliana. Are there any organizations that come to mind that approach climate justice, equity, and accessibility especially well, and what makes them exceptional?
Okay, so this is an excellent question that I am actually still working on finding an answer to for the UK. Again, back to that whole thing about how difficult it was for me to have conversations about environmental justice when, especially in the context of race, I would just be told that, you know, oh, UK doesn't have a race problem. We just have a class problem. I'm like, oh, it could be both. So I'm actually,
right.
I'm actually, I'm not even sure, to be fully honest, I'm not sure what organizations here do. I know there are a lot of grassroots groups that do this work, but you know, they're community groups and aren't getting funding, probably don't even have websites. So I think I unfortunately can't really give too much, but I think Farah might know better.
Yeah. There's a few. It would be great to get some examples from the US as well, but in the UK there's organizations like Platform who do work on climate justice. There's May Project Gardens, which is a community garden that works with refugees to teach them English through learning about hip hop and permaculture. And the work that they do is really great and really accessible, and they share that through things like sort of all-day events, and they release their music in order to fundraise for the work they do with refugees. So yeah, they're actually one of my favorite organizations who are doing that kind of work.
Cool. Oh, somebody asked if I could give examples of wars in the US. I can. One great one is We Act. So We Act, you just look that up, We Act for environmental justice. They're based out of Harlem. They have a DC office as well. There is the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. There are a lot of networks and coalitions. I think the Environmental Justice Health Alliance is a good one to look into. There's also the Indigenous Environmental Network. Top of my head, let me think. There's one in Chicago that I'm trying to think of. LV, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. There's come on, sorry, let me just think for a second. The Southwest Network for Economic and Environmental Justice. But yeah, those are some good ones. You should definitely look into that. And then, you know, you look into that. Oh, obviously, how could I leave them out? Silly of me. Tejas, it's the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. They're great. They're in Houston. They're doing great work. So there are a lot of organizations like that who are doing great stuff in the U.S.
Yeah, and they're always, you know, people who are hidden and don't have the hugest platforms. And if you know of anyone who's working in ways like this, please do send them our way. We're always really pleased to platform people. And as has been mentioned in the chat, we are working on pulling together a resource hub at Julie's Bicycle. Coming soon.
Yeah, you do great work. I just want to shout that out right now, how amazing I think the work that you all are doing is. I took a look at the website too and some of the resources you all have, and I was like, okay, I'm going to save this. I'm going to save one of them. It was on communication, actually. It was like, I have to remember that because I get very long-winded. So, so thank you for everything that you all are doing.
Thank you. And we've got one last question, which I would like to get to from Amy Thompson. So very quickly, we are working on our environmental policy. Our aim is to be as radical as possible. What would this look like as a small scale theatre company? We're doing research, but struggling with pinning down examples of radical and realistic actions that we can take and put in our policy and action plan.
What would your radical and realistic actions look like for your action plan? You know, I'm going to be honest. That's a question that I think I might need a little more time to.
I have a very quick answer, which is to look at your money. And money is a very difficult thing, especially at this point. But looking at where you, for example, invest your pensions, that's a really you know, not easy, but it's a good first step to start to think about what you do structurally, because it's really difficult as a small scale company to you know, completely change everything about you might not have a venue, you might not have much control over many parts of how you work, but divesting is a really good starting point. And talking to local communities about the other ways you can invest, maybe not monetarily, but investing in communities in other ways.
Yes.
Great. So we have one last question from us before we close up, and we want to know, what is your climate superpower? What do you bring to the table, Sharice? What are you all about?
Let's see. Okay, my superpower, my climate superpower. Funny, this is the second time today I've been asked something about a superpower. Earlier, it was during a work meeting, and I said that if I could have a superpower, it would be to communicate with anything and everything. But my climate superpower, I think, would be making connections between seemingly disparate things and getting folks who would normally not consider in the environment or environmentalism to just take a look at it a little bit. Yeah, I don't know if there's like a shorter word to use for that, but that's my climate. And honestly, it's even me saying that out loud is a big thing, because I don't usually, you know, I'm usually like, oh no, I didn't do anything. No, I don't have any superpowers. But I'm like, no, I'm going to own that, because earlier this summer, you know, one of those shiny graphics that was going around about things you could do, it was like, you know, you don't have to do all the things. You don't have to be an activist into this, into this, into this. And it said, and it gave like 8 different roles for people. And mine was weaver. And I think that kind of that's what it is. That's what I do. And I can owe that to my ADHD for not being able to focus on anything too long. But when I do, I get really into it.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's that is the superpower that you wanted in your work meeting, communicating with everything and everyone. That's exactly it, isn't it? That you have to be able to communicate across so many different things in order to communicate climate effectively. So I think you've already got that superpower, Sharice. Brilliant. So that's time for us today. I'm going to hand back to Chiara to close off the session. So thank you so much, Sharice.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody who participated.
Thanks so much, Sharice. That was really, really amazing. And yeah, thanks so much to everyone who is tuning in and has spent the last hour with us. We hope that you feel connected to each other and to everything that we've talked about. And we really encourage everyone to just take a moment after this ends to sit and translate and think about ways to translate some of what we've spoken about into your work day to day. And again, that might be quite small actions or it might be quite big ones. And if it feels overwhelming, remember those wise words from Sharice right at the end, that you don't have to do everything. Find your strength and then think about how you can use that strength to move things forward. A few other sort of points in summary: justice is about more than representation. Don't be tokenistic. Inclusivity, equality, justice take a lot of work. They have to be genuine. Don't leave anyone out. Look at the way that you're defining things. Who's it letting in? Who's it keeping out? How can you make sure that you're not gatekeeping? What are you rewarding? What are you supporting? What are your guidelines for deciding that? And who does that really serve? And what does that mean the consequences of your actions are? And also, as arts organizations and artists, I think one of the things that came through is remember that you have this whole other skill set. So don't let the scientific jargon intimidate you, because it's not just about that. But also, if you are working with other communities to tell stories, don't let that be an extractive relationship either. Make sure it's about an exchange. And I think for the non-arts organizations tuning in, recognize that different skill sets that artists have and how we break down those silos. So I think in response to Sarah's question as well, how do we make this stuff happen quickly? What if every conservation organization had an artist in residence who was working on environmental justice initiatives? And lastly, no more excuses like there isn't enough political will. Let's go out there and make it happen. So you can keep this conversation going using the Creative Climate Chat hashtag. Sign up to the JB Bulletin to stay in touch. Our next Creative Climate Chat is actually going to dig into some of these issues a bit more. Again, from an American perspective, it's on the 2nd of September at the same time with the brilliant Ron White from Deep Green Philly. So Ron is, he's a Philadelphia-based environmental activist. And he, among other things, he's a project coordinator for Trash Academy, which works with artists, students, and local residents. And Ron was one of the participants in our Creative Climate Leadership program that we ran in the USA in partnership with EcoArts Connections and the University of Arizona just before lockdown at Biosphere 2. And if you haven't seen it, I think there's a BBC documentary about Biosphere 2 on at the moment, and it is this strange project where they tried to build self-sustaining globes in the middle of the Arizona desert. And then the other Creative Climate Chat we have announced is with Nick Merriman, Chief Executive of the Horniman Museums and Gardens, and that's on the 4th of November, and he'll be talking about the museum's Climate and Ecology Manifesto. And if you'd like to listen to any of the Colour Green podcast series, which are more conversations linking art, activism and social justice, you can find those on the JB website. And lastly, we have an upcoming webinar on the 25th of August, looking at the environmental impact of our digital art and projects and how we practically work to reduce them from e-waste to energy use. So again, thank you very much. We are going to collate resources and send them around afterwards, along with a really quick survey. If you have a moment to fill that out, that's very helpful to make sure we keep improving these. So thank you very much.